Hi, welcome to Behind the Scenes with Mr. Rogers. This is the backstory, the rest of the story about the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood Show. When I was 18, I had the great fortune of going to WQED in Pittsburgh, and that's where Mr. Rogers Neighborhood Show was filmed. And I went there as an intern to study film and television production. However, I got enamored of Mr. Rogers, and I felt this amazing connection to him and attraction to being around him and watching him and learning from him. He became like an urban shaman for me. I didn't have those terms then, but he was one of the first people that I learned from how to deal with the world and people in a more expanded way, in a more creative way. So I volunteered without pay after I did my internship for filmmaking. I volunteered to work as a grip or a set, sort of a grunt, just putting the sets together and taking them down and just doing odds and ends. So I volunteered to be on his show just because I wanted to be around him and watch him and see how he dealt with people and situations. So one of the main things that we had to do was to construct the whole set, put the set together of the castle, the trolley, the tree for the owl, and everything else that was in the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood set. Because the set had to be struck or taken down after every taping so that they could shoot other television shows in the studio. So right before they were shooting a series, a particular show, we would have to spend 3 or 4 hours putting the set together, and then afterwards, late at night, we'd take it down. And one of the things I really enjoyed about that was, as we were putting the set together, once it was together, Mr. Rogers would come in and he would have to rehearse the puppets. And here's one of them today. I brought one of them with me. This is the Prince. And I happen to have, I found along the way, 4 of the original puppets from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And this is one of them. This is the Prince. I also have the Queen, the Princess, and the Joker, Jacques. So I'll introduce them in subsequent videos when I tell other anecdotes of Mr. Rogers. But right now I'm going to introduce you to the Prince, and we're going to tell you the story of how Mr. Rogers would counsel the workers at the TV station through the puppets. It was very interesting there. The crew was basically blue collar and beer drinking Pittsburgh Steeler fans, and they didn't generally talk to Mr. Rogers in the hallway or the lunchroom at all. In fact, they made fun of Mr. Rogers quite a bit because he was very emotional, he was very expressive, and in those days, in the 1960s, they found that something that was an easy target. So they would make fun of Mr. Rogers behind his back. And he knew this. I could tell he knew this, but he still treated them with great respect and was very friendly and pretended that he didn't know how they talked about him when he wasn't around. Well, the interesting thing was, once we constructed the set for the Mr. Rogers Neighborhood, Mr. Rogers would have to practice, and he'd have the Prince or other puppets, the owl, the king, and he would go through their motions because he had to have them play ball and interact with each other and make things. So he would have to go through how to move the puppets, and he'd practice for an hour rehearsing their actions before we would actually shoot. And very often, at least once or twice a week, while he was in the set alone rehearsing the puppets' actions and activities, one of the crew members, the cameraman or one of the carpenters or the electrician, one of the crew members would come in, make sure that no one else was watching, and this crew member would start to engage Mr. Rogers in conversation through the puppet, but he would talk to the puppet, the Prince or the owl or the king or whoever. The squirrel, he would talk to the puppet. And of course, Mr. Rogers was down behind the scenery, moving the puppets with his hand. And as he did that, one of the crew members would start to talk to the puppet and would just simply start sharing a problem. And these crew members shared very intimate, very personal problems about impotency, not being able to get it up with their wife or girlfriend, about health problems, very serious health problems, about problems with their kids and drugs, or money problems. And the crew members would just start talking about their problems. Of course, I can see why they felt safe to do that, because that's a lot what this show was about. Is kids would talk about, Mr. Rogers would talk about it, and guests and kids would talk about, the challenges that they were having in life. So these crew members would just start talking about their problems, and Mr. Rogers, through the puppets, would start to counsel them with the puppet's voice and the puppet's mannerisms, not indicating at all that he was Mr. Rogers inside the puppet with his hand. And the puppets, in their own voice and their own personality, would counsel give therapy or counseling to the crew workers in length about their problems. And it was very moving. Sometimes the crew members would cry, and he would talk them through that, through the puppets again. And what was really fun for me was Mr. Rogers assigned me the job of keeping all the other crew members out of the studio. If this counseling, this ad hoc, spontaneous counseling started to happen, my job was to close the studio and keep everyone out until he was done counseling this crew member. And then once I saw that they were done, then I would let everyone in and we would start production again. Now this was very costly, and the manager of the station, so they were very upset. But it was Mr. Rogers' show, but it would cost thousands of dollars to keep 30, 40 workers outside the studio doing nothing for half an hour while he counseled one of the crew members. But that was Mr. Rogers' priority. It was us, people. And so that was the most important thing about the whole show and about Mr. Rogers' life. So I watched Mr. Rogers share himself in whatever way people could allow him to share or to help them. And incidentally, it was very interesting. Afterwards, after he counseled these crew members on these very sensitive subjects, when he would pass one of these crew members that he had counseled in the hallway or the lunchroom, they didn't even look at each other. They basically pretended it never happened. Like what stays in Las Vegas stays in Vegas. So what happens in the studio with the puppets stays in the studio. However, I did notice over time that the crew members who had been counseled by the puppets, by Mr. Rogers, over time they would make fun less of Mr. Rogers, and they would take part a lot less in the way people talked about Mr. Rogers behind his back. So it was very fun to watch that whole dynamic, and I learned so much about how to reach out to people and how to work with whatever's available and reach people in whatever way that they were open to being helped. Thank you. Say goodbye to the Prince.